Hello, good evening, and welcome to this live broadcast of Unsweetened Conversations, Bush Tea Services. I'm Simon Sharkey, I'm co-curator of If Not Us, Who, If Not Today, When, which is at the Pipe Factory. You can find us on the Climate Fringe, and if you Google us or Insta, you'll get the full programme. 4 floors of exhibitions from artists from all over the world, and conversations and participatory workshops that are taking place during COP26. Tonight we're going to share a conversation that was recorded live, but we're broadcasting it live from the Pipe Factory. And I'll say no more because the conversation, I think, says it all. Hope you enjoy it.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Peggy Brunache of the Beniba Centre for Slavery Studies, in conjunction with Glasgow's Women Library in association with the Necessary Space. And today, we're having a very unique event. We're calling it Unsweetened Conversations, Bush Tea Services with Annalee Davis and friends. We have Barbadian visual artist Annalee Davis. We also have Glasgow artist, sculptor Ashanti Harris. We have the masterminds behind Artisan Growers in Aberdeen, Robert and Michelle Sullivan. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us.
So, this is a unique time that we're in. Everyone is concerned about the environment, climate change, the revitalization of Black Lives Matters has brought more of the past, particularly our colonial past, our slavery past into focus. But trying to think how any of this is connected, not just in the past, but to us in the present, is something I hope we can delve into a bit, especially over this concept, this performance of drinking tea. Annalee, this is a art installation and performance that you started back in 2016, correct?
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So in 2016, I was commissioned by Cooking Sections to produce a work for their project called Empire Remain Shops. And I did a collection of teacups and saucers and a tea serving pot called a monkey pot, which we use in Barbados for cooling water. And that was really a way, and that was really a way to kind of, while I was in London at Delphina Foundation, it was kind of an act of reparation. It was bringing an unsweetened tea to London for the Empire Remain Shop project. People would sign up to have tea with me, and we would have a conversation, and I would pour tea. Now, this wasn't the tea service I was using then. My tea service was a collaboration with a Barbadian potter, Hamilton Wiltshire, and the tea service was made using all Barbadian clay, but interjected into the tea service were shards that I find when I walk on the farm where I live. And those shards are 1700s, 1800s. They're pieces of porcelain that came out as ballast in the ships. They were used, cheap crockery sets that were used on the island, and wherever you walk in Barbados or anywhere in the Caribbean, actually, on farmer plantations, you find these shards coming up in the soil. So I intervened these shards into the tea service, which was an imperfect tea service, so when I would serve tea, it would drip, and it would kind of speak to the messiness and the leakiness of history and the inadequate or incomplete narratives we have around that history. So I would serve this tea that was sort of speaking back to the British tradition of drinking tea, which Robert Southey referred to as a blood-sweetened beverage because it was made on plantations in the East, sweetened by sugar on plantations in the West Indies. But what I was doing at the time was harvesting wild plants from the farm I lived on, and making my own kind of concoction. That was my kind of initial tea ceremony at that time.
This is fascinating. I'm ready to start with some of these teas. This is a proprietary blend, correct?
Yes.
Could you tell us what plants infuse this?
So this is a collaboration with a chemist in Barbados called Dr. Sonia Peter, and she has a project called Heritage Teas. We worked together, so I provided her with plants that I collected, which included breadfruit, bay leaf, turmeric, and peppermint. And she then made the tea. We call it Ancestral Voices, and it speaks to, in terms of calling it Ancestral Voices, it speaks to the tradition of drinking tea within the enslaved society, the way in which plants were used on these marginal plots of land that were not very fertile soils. And those plots of land were referred to by Sylvia Wynter as a kind of a pre-capitalist site located within the larger capitalist site of the kind of colonial machinery that was the plantation. But these small plots is where we can imagine that the enslaved became human. This is where they felt human. They developed community. They had, there was a way of oral traditions where knowledge was passed on. This is where they began to understand the healing properties of plants. It's where they could retain African retentions in terms of spiritual practices, and it's where they planted ground provisions. So it was sustenance, it was healing, and it was religious practice. So what we have in here, the breadfruit, which you're all welcome to taste. The breadfruit, well, this was a plant, a tree that was used that had a lot of carbohydrate and fiber. So this was a very, I'm sure all of you with Caribbean roots would know about the breadfruit plant. So it provided a lot of food, but it also has the capacity to regulate diabetes. That's really important in countries that have a sugar industry because people are suffering a lot with diabetes. The bay leaf is used a lot in Barbados as a cooling tea. We speak a lot about cooling tea to remove heat from the body. It has antioxidant properties. The turmeric, which gives it some of that beautiful yellow color, you would know a lot in cooking, but it has very strong anti-inflammatory qualities. And the mint is really good for, bronchial stuff. So you want to have this combination of it looks beautiful, it has a lovely aroma, it tastes great, and it also has all of these healing properties.
I want to turn to Robert and Michelle because the two of you run artisanal growers, so you have a very intimate relationship with the land, much like, I would say, the experiences of the enslaved as well as their descendants. What is your current thoughts about the land and your connection to it? Is it in relation to ancestral thoughts, or is it an honoring, or is it just something you felt you needed to just reconnect with the land in a different way?
I would say it's probably more religious.
Yeah, more spiritual.
I think it's more spiritual, yeah. Because we first moved to the countryside about 14 years ago because we felt that, we started to take our faith more seriously. And with doing that, we read a book by a lady called Ellen G. White, which is a little book called Country Living. And it spoke so much about the benefits of actually living, in a rural environment. We had to very quickly find a new occupation. That's right. And so we ended up going back to that book, and it spoke so much about the benefits of working with the soil. It could basically provide you with, an income and
to be self-sufficient.
Yeah, which is really what we wanted, isn't it?
Yeah, and in a way it's kind of reclaiming, I think, just some of the things that you were just talking about. It's kind of speaking to that sort of old era of reclaiming some of the things that I guess we used to do in the past. But because things, and I'm not trying to work this out, but it's just the way things have happened, whether it's technology, whether it's the the way that the industry, that we've moved away
We have.
from that lifestyle. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
To where we are now, and so we feel that in a way we're going back, as it were, to reclaim that particular way of life.
That's right. And not just that, over the course of time, we'll find that since there's been so much industrialization,
Yeah.
it's huge tractors and it's almost like monoculture and, you know, fields upon fields upon fields of just barley.
No
There's no
diversity.
diversity, you know, and for us, obviously, if we wanted to, we could have got into tractor farming, you know, big sort of large-scale tractor farming. But we decided, no, we wanted something that would serve our family.
Yeah.
It would serve the children. It would, you know, get them involved, and you know, they could come out and, you know, we have many pictures on Instagram of our children barefooted out in the soil and digging and hoeing and just really
Just
enjoying that space. You
Yeah.
know, free from the sort of artificialness, if there's such a word, of the way life is today.
Now.
If I may ask you, Ashanti, you are also an artist. Has the environment and concerns of climate change and necessarily our background as descendants of enslaved people, does that influence your work in any way?
Yeah, definitely. I think my work is really centered in place. I'm half Guyanese, and I've always used my work as a way to delve into my Guyanese heritage. I always think of myself as a child and how I learned about my heritage, and it was so often through art. So I think I really tried to do that with my own art making. So within doing that, and also being based in Glasgow for the last 15 years, a lot of my research has been about the relationship between Scotland and Guyana. I've been doing research into Guyanese women who were in Scotland in the 18th and 19th centuries, how they kind of came to be there, and using my own experiences and the experiences of people around me, a lot of collectives that I'm in, to kind of speculate on these women's histories. And more recently, in looking at this historical relationship, I've been doing some research into the twinning of Aberdeen and Georgetown in Guyana, and the interesting sort of central part of this twinning is the fact that in 2015, Guyana, ExxonMobil discovered large quantities of high-quality oil-bearing sandstone off the coast of Guyana, off the coast of Georgetown, and then by 2019, they started making money from the production of this oil, and in 2019, that was also when Aberdeen was twinned with Georgetown. So I was just kind of
Very interesting.
Yeah.
As for those who may not know, Aberdeen
It's an oil
is
district.
it's an oil district.
Yeah, but what many people probably don't know in Aberdeen, I think people know in Guyana, but it's not necessarily regularly recognised, is the fact that Guyana and Scotland do have this long history that is really centred in extraction. So centred in extraction from the transatlantic slave trade, in the extraction of people, in indentureship, but also then when the farming industry kind of declined into the extraction that was the minerals, so gold, diamonds, bauxite across the country. And I think just kind of thinking about this relationship to the earth, to place, to people, to extraction, it feels like this, that kind of bubbling sort of pot. I'm almost imagining it like oil, this kind of condensing of history underneath the ground, starting to become something. And
Based on exploitation,
Yeah.
right? If it wasn't the exploitation of human beings, of enslaved Africans who were taken as captives, it is the exploitation of the land to the point that it exhausts the natural nutrients. The monoculture that you were talking about of barley today mirrors the monoculture of sugar or tobacco in the past. But yet, from what I understand, with this, the decline of the sugar industry, particularly in Barbados, there has been a kind of reclamation of the land for other purposes. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing more recently now is there's small farmers that are taking greater pride in working the land. There was a lot of shame around working in the land.
That's right.
And this obviously is caught up in history. It's also around issues of race. So at the period of independence, when education became free, people were trying to find new ways to support themselves off of the plantation. Lots of migration to the Panama Canal, the Windrush generation, and people using education as a way to get out. There was very limited access to acquiring land. What we're seeing now more recently is small farmers that are doing organic farming, both black and white Barbadians, interestingly, that are doing small organic farms. And then Dr. Sonia Peter that I'm working with, who is doing these heritage teas. So there's a kind of I think a new kind of pride around thinking about feeding ourselves, sustainability. I mean, we import close to 90% of what we eat. So if we're looking at ecological issues and the increasing threat of hurricanes, like we just had a hurricane in Barbados not that long ago. It was only a Category 1, but it caused quite a bit of damage. If we had Hurricane Dorian, which hit the Bahamas a couple of years ago, or if Miami is hit by a hurricane and wiped out, our importation of food is really problematic. So we really need to begin to think about sustainability and growing our own food and producing food and thinking about limiting the use of pesticides and chemicals, because that has affected not only the underground aquifers. We're a limestone island, but there's also runoff that goes in to the sea, and that then is bleaching the corals. So there are all of these, all of these kind of side effects. So I think really considering kind of the ecological damage that Barbados and small island developing states are on the front line of climate change at the moment, we really need to reposition ourselves in relationship to the land and think about post-plantation economies and post-extractive decisions.
Robert, Michelle, being that this was the farming that you do now was not something you grew up with, right? This was not part of your family tradition, but it is something that you got into later in life, and you're succeeding quite well. What could we do for those of us that don't have land that way? I live in a flat. What could I do to find myself more connected to the land if I don't have property in that manner?
Yeah, I would say start with what you want. So in other words, like you were saying, if you're in a flat or something like that, you may not have a large garden, but you may be able to do something on your veranda. Let's just say. We grow a lot of what's called microgreens.
Yes.
Now, the good thing about them, two things that we're really excited about, is that they're nutrient dense. They're actually a superfood.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is that they grow really, really quickly. So from seed to harvest on average it's about 7 to 10 days. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that's very, very quick. If that sort of piques your interest, then you could then move on to something else, which could mean that you're so excited about growing your own and maybe even being self-sufficient in a few things that you might be like, well, let me go down and look at the local allotment area and see if, but before you go there, our thing is get your hands dirty where you are right now, and that can be right there on your veranda, not a problem at all.
Or supporting the organic farmers.
Or supporting
Right?
people that are already
doing
what they're doing. For a lot of people, it's ease of use in terms of why a lot of us maybe just go down to the supermarket and get what we get, and it's sometimes a little bit harder to go out of your way to support a local grower.
It might be a bit more expensive, as well.
Yeah.
But that's because there's a lot more goes into it.
If I could add to that, one of the side effects of COVID in Barbados is that these farmers are now offering home delivery, which the large supermarkets were doing, and they were totally saturated. So I think people are actually beginning to support small local farmers and organic farmers in a way they didn't even know they existed.
Yeah.
It was just because the large supermarket chains were so overwhelmed that people were, where do I get my produce from? And so they actually, a lot of light was being shown on them, and they have, I think, benefited in some ways from that.
That was our experience actually, because our veg box service just went through the roof over COVID. Yeah, it's it was manic. But in answer to your question, another thing that is a possibility is actually volunteering on a local farm, because they always need help, you know, and so if the margin isn't that great, perhaps it can be a bit costly employing people, and so to go and volunteer, you never know, they may even say, well, if you come and do some hours, you could get a free veg box a week or something, so it could be a way to support.
Thinking about what you were explaining of the microgreens, Robert, as a superfood, and it seems like quite a number of the ingredients that went into this blend would definitely be considered superfoods, right? The breadfruit, which was imported to feed the enslaved, is a carbohydrate-laden plant that does not cause, or it doesn't lend to diabetes, contracting diabetes. It also lowers cholesterol. We all know peppermint tea is renowned for its properties of helping your digestion, cooling elements because of the menthol, the bay leaf, which I imagine this is the West Indian bay leaf rather than
so it's really strong.
Right, which often is used for, it's so strong aromatically that they put it in cologne and aftershave lotion. And then there's the turmeric that, as you've mentioned, is great for, it has its culinary use, but it also has its medicinal use. I grew up, because my parents were from Haiti, so I grew up with tea being medicinal. It had a medicinal purpose. Did you grow up in a similar way of consuming tea as a medicinal item?
I mean, it's interesting thinking back, because I definitely grew up very, very much with tea in the sort of colonial sense of tea, with Yorkshire tea and Earl Grey tea, and coming home and my dad's like, who wants tea? Kind of thing, tea with milk. But thinking about in relation to medicinal, I was always given kind of tea with turmeric and with honey when I was sick. And I never, I think, as from being a child, and I don't think I ever necessarily thought about that being working with herbs or working with plants in a medicinal way. It was just became so ingrained in life, like drink this when you feel unwell. So yeah, I think in a mixture, it's like maybe that relationship to plant life in tea has been there behind the scenes, kind of coming out almost in a non-thinking way.
It is interesting, Ashanti, that you have or had both the colonial sense of tea, which historically speaking, it was a status signifier in the beginning, right? It was something that only a very privileged few could afford, and then eventually it peters down into the masses, but then becomes an energy drink to help keep workers in the Industrial Revolution and factories going, particularly with the sugar that is also being exported from the West, tea being exported from the East. But the idea of tea in terms of how enslaved Africans, their descendants, and indentured South Asians use it is something we probably should be thinking more about, not just consuming tea as something to energize us, but the idea of thinking more about, well, how do we support our local organic farmers? How do we support our immune system by being better to ourselves? How do we connect ourselves with the environment in healthy ways rather than the detrimental ways of monoculture, consumptions of sugar? It is very easy for us, particularly those of us that are in privileged spaces where we could easily go to buy more expensive food. But as you have started to explain, there are steps that we can start to take better control of not only our diet and our health, but support what should be a revolution to revitalize the earth.
Yeah, I think some of it is about, and this is probably the hardest part. This is from my understanding, is about education or re-education, because for a lot of us, whether it's sort of in-your-face education as to what you think something is, down to what really is the story. And so, for example, as you were just saying, we may know, I know, for example, my mother, we wouldn't have tea, but we would have herbal teas and herbal, what really I would say are herbal remedies.
Yes.
Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
Right. And these things were that's just part of the culture, that's part of the way of life. You didn't think about it, it's just done. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. Even now, whenever I feel like my calcium levels are low, I can kind of tell you get tingly and in your fingers and things like that. I would make a calcium, like a mineral tea, which was basically nettles, which we have growing in abundance on the farm.
Free.
So get yourself a dehydrator and just dry them out, and So nettle tea, and I would put in there also red clover blossoms, which tends to grow just everywhere.
Wild.
Just everywhere. You
Perfect.
could pick blossoms from your garden.
Yeah, for free.
Don't mow your lawn, just let them grow
Yeah.
up and pick the blossoms, dry them off, because it's just very rich in minerals. And then just recently, one of our children had a cough, and I bought online. I just bought some ivy, English ivy, which just comes dried, and just given some of that with honey. And after one cup, her cough had finished. It's very, very powerful, very strong. Yeah.
But it's this information. I mean, we often have this conversation all the time. We're like, this information is sort of dying away within a lot of cultures. So it's interesting. Some of the things that you're talking about, and I'm like, this is just so true.
Yeah, I mean, I think it
We knew
speaks to
this.
decolonizing our diet,
Yeah.
right? And also developing a greater understanding of what is around our local context. Because, of course, coming out of a former British colony, our education was very much around, it was a colonial education.
Right.
Yes.
And you favored everything foreign.
Yeah.
And there was shame about what was local.
Yeah, local.
And these bush teas have a connection to Afro-spiritual practices, including something like obeah, or maybe people are more familiar with the term voodoo. But that was illegal for a long time. So these were covert practices, and you didn't really talk about it very much. But I think there's increasingly pride around that, and we need to think about decolonizing our palates and our diets, right? And not just because we have to use foreign exchange to buy that food.
Yeah.
So right now we have, in Barbados, I think it ends today, is a slow food week, where they're trying to promote knowledge and challenging people take up the 7-day slow food challenge, where you only eat local.
Yeah.
And the people who have put that on have just opened a restaurant called The Local, and they're trying to serve 85% local
Excellent.
food.
Wonderful.
I mean, the production of this tea, for example, we had, St. Vincent had a volcanic eruption on the 9th of April, which was horrendous, and it's 110 miles west of Barbados.
And you still.
And we had, what happened is the plumes were so high that they traveled on the anti-trade winds. So normally the wind would go from Barbados in the east to St. Vincent in the west, but the plumes were so high, they went through the stratosphere and they just came east, and they dumped like 90,000 tons of ash on Barbados.
So much ash.
For me, I would say that lockdown was worse than COVID, because we locked in our house. We couldn't go outside to breathe because it was unsafe. And it was terrifying. And I think in this year we've had COVID, we've had the volcano, we've had a hurricane. There was a small earthquake off the south coast of Barbados, several miles off. And it just felt like these environmental concerns were so profound.
Yeah.
And when we couldn't go outside to breathe, it was terrifying. And so, one of the reasons for doing this tea was I developed for the first time in my life cough-induced asthma, and I was locked indoors for 6 weeks. Like, I literally could not go outside the door. And so this was also developed as a way to have a greater understanding of things that were locally available, and to kind of, ease, the pulmonary kind of response to that ash fall, because that's toxic, that stuff that we were inhaling. So I think also learning about things that are available to you in your local environment is becoming so important wherever you are.
Absolutely. So, with the work that you do and your artistic endeavors in connection with the environment, as well as how it connects to the past now. Ashanti, are you thinking about how can your work better influence ways that we can improve the way we move through the world, the way we need to heal the world and heal ourselves? Have you been thinking about any of that?
Yeah, I think really similar to what you were both saying about education. I always think about that in relation to my work. So how are you informing people of things? I'm always learning, I'm always learning, researching, but also thinking about how I'm sharing that new knowledge with people, how I'm making it accessible to people in a way where maybe having it written in this book or something is not the right way, but how are you getting people to engage with it physically? And even though I'm a sculptor by training, I do a lot of work with my body, working with movement, working with performance. And I really loved what you said about when you feel ill, you are like certain things, the calcium deficiency, you feel it in different parts of your body. And I think there's something in this connection with your body and a connection with the land, because we are all connected. And that's the beginning of the process. I think when I'm doing a lot of research, I'm making these artworks, I'm thinking, how do I hold this in my body?
Yes.
What does this feel like?
Yes.
And start developing this connection with myself, not thinking about it as a series of parts that all need to be treated separately and given medicine, and more like this kind of all-round, this full understanding of me in relation to all of these things, whether it be kind of histories of extraction, our colonial history, or whether it be kind of a relationship to the land, the things around you, the way the land is treated, and how that then intends things that continue to affect the body.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've consumed our tea, and what is left is a little cold. However, these conversations are certainly not, they're not going to go away. We need to find ways to solve the problems that we have caused to the earth. The work that the two of you are doing with artisanal growers,
The artisan grower.
The artisan grower, need to get it right, is phenomenal. And the work that, in terms of learning how to have this information put out there, distributed in creative ways, right, is just another aspect of this holistic way we need to come about this. I'd like to thank all of you for this, my God, enlivened conversation, the need for a solution or set of solutions. I'd like to also thank everyone else who helped put this event together. We're here in the Hunterian Museum, so I definitely want to thank Lee Scott, the Hunterian Museum itself. I'd like to thank Glasgow Women's Library, Caroline, who's helped with this. Of course, we cannot forget, this is in association, whose brainchild this really was, is Simon Sharkey of the Necessary Space. So until we have another meeting, I bid you all a good day, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.